Hi everyone, my name is Sylvan Kaufman. I'm going to be your moderator for this webinar. I want to welcome everyone to Evaluating Conservation Landscape Designs. This is one of a series of webinars that we're offering this year called A Focus on Sustainability. This series was developed back in 2013 by a group of organizations known regionally in the United States for their quality education programs for professionals in the landscaping industries and landscape design. We're working together to expand the reach of these education programs through our webinar series. In case you're not familiar with the organizations, they're all nonprofit, largely volunteer groups, and they include, and you'll actually see that on your screen I'm listed as Penny Lewis. Penny's actually the director of the Ecological Landscaping Alliance in the northeastern United States, and they are responsible for the overall organization of the webinar series. I'm a volunteer with the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, CCLC, which is located in the Mid-Atlantic area. And the webinar series is also co-sponsored by Eco Landscape California. So we usually have audience members from across the country. So tonight I'm very pleased to have Ann English as our presenter. Ann is the program manager for the RainScapes Program in the Watershed Management Division of the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Environmental Protection. Ann's career spans private, nonprofit, and governmental sectors, as well as several years teaching at 2 universities. I met Ann as a fellow faculty member in George Washington University's Sustainable Landscape Design program. Ann has always approached design ecologically, even when her clients weren't necessarily environmentally aware. But it's hard to argue against a beautiful landscape that also requires fewer inputs, right? Ann earned her Master's of Regional Planning from the Pennsylvania State University and a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Georgia. So I'm now going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Ann, and thank you all for attending and Ann for presenting tonight.
Oh, thank you, Penny. Penny, Sylvan, sorry. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and how to look at conservation landscapes really very similarly to traditional landscape evaluation, and then putting the whole thing together. So I'm going to be going over, some basic vocabulary that typical landscape architects and designers, the more artsy side of the world, uses. But then that language gives us a basis in the ecological design world for adding to how we describe how to fix a problem or how to make your design look better. You can look at your ecological plant community organization and start to discover it's all the same thing. I call landscape architecture a time and space art, because we are moving people through the landscape over time. So this picture here is, very standard, formal landscape design.
And
you could, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but for some reason we're not seeing your picture.
Okay, let me see. I thought I had it. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, can you see? How about now?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, I'll go. Should I show you the other picture?
If you'd like, go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. All right, so there's some beautiful asters. So there's mostly text on that slide. So this is just traditional landscape design. Formal, you can describe it in terms of its line, its texture, and it provides progression through space and repetition. But this design didn't just happen out of the air. Somebody wanted it this way. And so you can take those ideas for how people want space organized, and then you can lay over the native plant communities that would be appropriate for the landscape and create ecologically functional designs as well as aesthetically beautiful. This coastal Maine Botanic Gardens that I was fortunate to go up to was in late August, early September, and you can see that there's repetition of color, there's repetition of vertical line, there's a backdrop of a uniform texture. So these are all ways that landscape design would traditionally describe it. But then when you look at it ecologically, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in there for all the pollinators and other users of the space. So if you can overlay those two things, you can get more precise critique, and you can figure out how to make a design that you thought was going to be good, make it even better, and to have very specific strategies for changing a specific need. So in this example, you see the big stone in the middle in the back, and that would be what would be an accent feature. Well, if you wanted to really ramp that up, you'd say, you know, this is okay, but imagine it bigger or bolder, and then you would say, well, is that better or worse? And if it's not better, then you would be looking for why it's not better in terms of visual terms, even though you might find that it is better. So this vocabulary talks about things like unity and variety and balance, elements of color, form, and shape. And this particular landscape you're looking at right now is actually a diorama. It was a Philadelphia flower show. But why does it work as a composition? There's repetition of the color in the background. It pulls together with repetition of the fine texture on the left and the right through the window. There's contrast of the orange to the purplish blue, and so they're on opposite sides of the color wheel, which makes it more noticeable. So these are all things that you can use as an ecological designer, even though you're creating something very much in the native landscape palette wherever you are. The social psychology has figured out why people like to look at things. They like things with mystery and complexity, things that people draw the eye in. You hear that expression all the time. Well, that goes into mystery, like what's around that corner. And yet it's not overwhelming. It's legible. So there's enough order for a human to want to proceed into the scene. Some people have called that prospect refuge, and there's a whole lot of social psychology research on that sort of thing. So once you've figured out you need to unify something, you know, there's just too much going on. And I think plant people, of all people, are guilty of just wanting one of everything. Horticulturists are known for that. But if you want to unify something, that means you have to have more than one. And then you would repeat it, and that would help you achieve unity. If you want to create contrast or discord, you might use it through color, or you might have bold texture next to fine texture. You might have big things next to small things, because that's something that's going to draw attention to it. And then you can harmoniously relate things, whether they are functionally related, like a shovel and a clipper, so they're functionally related even though they're dissimilar, or something like that. So these are just, you know, kind of different way to talk about landscapes. Then you start to look at them. So I wanted to show you this. These are two conservation landscapes, very residential scale. And so then I can describe them with all that design language of order and unity. So how are you getting order and unity in the one on the left? Well, it's orderly because you have these groupings of color. You have groupings of texture. You have that line of the bed that's drawing the eye out, and that creates accent. You have repetition of the line and form on the right also, which unifies it, and then there are these spots of color with contrasting complementary color, which is very eye-catching as you're coming down the road. So these are just fun ways that you can use this design language in your ecological designs that has a lot of curb appeal. This is at the Museum of Natural History in DC. It's a butterfly garden, so it was designed, the main client were butterflies, but the main users that go through the space, besides butterflies, are people. So they had to make it pleasing to both. So they have the big massing of color, which is attractive to butterflies, but it's also attractive to people. And they have repetition, which draws your eye through from the verbena back to the Joe Pye. They have lines of the little blue stem grass, and this it sets the foreground as being kind of very fine texture, and then the back has a coarser texture, which collapses it towards you visually. The shapes are clear and orderly, and this is, very acceptable to the public eye. In the world of stormwater, you have repetition of forms. This is a couple of Green Street projects here in Montgomery County, and it's been a learning curve for how do you redesign the street edge for stormwater. So using a native plant palette for our area, which simplified the palette, the switchgrass and rudbeckia that was showing right here. Then on the right, it was iris versicolor, so in the spring it's really pretty. There's also some river oats in there. But you have the opportunity to increase ecological function even as you are creating visual interest and definition. Again, looking at this concept of repetition, contrast, and harmony. So the garden on the left is the before, and the garden on the right is the after. So you could say that the first side, you could critique it by saying it's overly unified. There's too much repetition of that ground cover. You could also say it's full of invasive plants, and those plants have got to go. But visually, you could say, well, one of the problems is it's bland, it's boring, there's too much of one. So when we bring in a new design, we're not just going to put in a sweep of one kind of plant, because it needs some variety. And so then the new design, they straightened out the line of the edge of the turf to make it more consistent with the edge of the patio. They added a series of groupings which allow for more variety, and yet they're a similar scale, so they're all working together. And this garden, as it fills in, will not have these big areas of mulch. It will become more covered. So when you want to create a sense of place, how do you do it? So you're trying to do this balance and harmony, and you have these three basic approaches, which is architectonic and geomorphic and naturalistic. So, institutional places like Longwood Gardens, but this is our classic. You're using plants in a very structural way to create framing and edging. The espaliered trees in the back, the planter box, the definition of the brick and the concrete. And then at the bottom, you could tell we've been doing this for a really long time. The House of the Painters was a Pompeian site, and people were doing a colonnade. They were doing formal forms within a planted courtyard. So these are not new ideas, and these are things that people have been drawn to for a very, very long time. This architectonic scale, just to remind you, is that gardens, before there was electricity, were where people moderated their local climate. This is, again, in Italy, but you could fill in a parterre on the left. I think Thomas Rainer and Claudia West have talked about these as frames, flexible frames. So within that parterre, you could fill it up with all kinds of native plants that would add a lot of ecological function, even as you had that geometry of the parterre bed. When you think about the historic role of a garden to moderate climate, a cool place in the summer, a protected place in the winter, I think it's well worth looking at historic design forms and to try to figure out how to adapt those ideas to our new ecological needs. Okay, I don't know what happened there. This is at the Biltmore Estate, where you're talking about for space, creates a sense of place. And so you come up into this very closed space. It's a hemlock forest. And then you come out into something directly contrasted, which is, in the words of Olmsted, thoroughly artificial. And it is thoroughly artificial. And then he takes you on past to see, hold on, let me see, takes you on past to look out and ties that landscape of the thoroughly artificial back into the Pisgah Mountain Range by framing it with a house and by sequencing it through the sculptures and the walls. So you can have, whether you were consciously building an ecology or building a form, you use both these native plants and the architecture side by side to create better design. Geomorphic. So this is something that's a little more comfortable for most people that are doing ecological design. You're mimicking the surrounding landscape. Again, this was at the Philadelphia Flower Show, and they were featuring the national park, so it was great. This was the Pine Barrens, and so the designer of this display, this is the same display front and back, but had taken the key plants that make you know that you're in the Pine Barrens and not in Tucson, and put it together. It's plants and the fencing and the rhythm of the plants to create a visual, and then added in on the other side some more traditional design elements. I think naturalistic design is what most ecological designers prefer and go after, and I want to point out that this doesn't mean you have to abandon aesthetic design. So this is a design that was first done at the Southeastern Flower Show, and the designer liked it so much, she was the president of the Native Plant Society, that she took it and put it back into her backyard, and she took the Japanese tea garden and used all southeastern native plants. And so she had to understand the aesthetic rhythm and form even as she was using this other plant palette. It was very, very successful in her backyard, and then fortunately she published it. So you can see that it looks like a Japanese tea garden, and yet you've got the Galax, you've got the Carolina rhododendron, you've got a weeping hemlock up at the top of the stairs, and you've got all of the cultural as well as ecological aspects within the framework of a garden. This is going on, it's expanding. This Brookside Gardens planting is using the idea of this matrix approach that has been put out most recently by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. But you can see that this gardener's interpretation of that approach is to use the Maryland Beauty Ilex opaca as a green spine to divide and create a backdrop in the winter, even as the sedges are going to fill in, and then there are other natives that are intermixed in this planting. And then on the right, you can see that you've got a big sweep of asters and that wrap around this clump of iris. And this sweep is very, very visually strong, and it's in beautiful line. Now, what you would have to do when you evaluate this is to say, okay, this is great for this week. What's it look like in the winter? What does it look like in the spring? And then you might have some ideas as to how to reinforce the ideas that are happening in that garden. Now, Cuba calls this their Piedmont view, and this is a landscape where they have worked to blend the traditional landscape of humans with the ecological Piedmont plant palette in a formal house setting. And I think that when you get all those things put together right, you have a place that people want to come back to over and over and over again. So how do you do that? You know, first, if you're going to start to use plant communities as the basis for your design or to expand it, you want to know which one fits your situation. So are you in a sandy soil? Are you in a clay soil? So you're going to look for even though these are novel ecosystems in most of our development, you're going to look for the plant communities you can draw from to create a planting palette that's going to be culturally similar and visually linked naturally. I did this using a number of sources, just to try to simplify it, because we deal with the public at the department all the time, and this is the public that's not typically or necessarily hiring someone. They might be do-it-yourselfers. So in this partial page of it, I mean, this is just maple wood, so this would be your mesic wood. So what are the key trees? What are the key shrubs? And it's not that there aren't other plants. It's just that these are the indicator plants. And then you might go down to the ground layer, and you might do a similar thing with, you know, what would be appropriate for an undisturbed woodland if you were going to do this planting plan. And so that gives you your palette that you start to work with, and then you have to figure out how the plants grow and what makes the most sense for which plant if you want a big ground cover area and which plant if you want an individual specimen. You have to know about how the plants like to grow in groups or by themselves. And what's been impressive in the last year is that, I think Gardening with Nature with James Van Sweden, that was one of the first books I saw that came out that really tried to marry these bolder plants into a design aesthetic that people would like. And they took on DC, and they've taken on, they've really started an acceptance of grasses and other things. But different resources are coming out, and all of them have this fundamental underlying concept of you're looking at the plant community to create gardens that make a place look like a place, that like Maryland look like Maryland, California look like California, but that you're not abandoning all the other things that we like about gardens, which might be a place to sit or it might be a place to look out. It's just using plants that get matched to the climate. So if you're just starting out on this, what would you do? You would probably use substitution, but these are 4 different ways that you can integrate native plants and community design into conventional design ideas. So you could substitute into traditional design form just a native plant palette. So at the Penn campus, they use bearberry and loose low-grow next to permeable pavers. In fact, the whole campus has really gone to a native plant palette, just substituting in very traditional planting beds, nice compositions of color, but similarly grouped. So you would naturally find them together in the woods, but you now find them together in the city. Down in Athens, Georgia, they use the Elysium parviflorum as a foundation plant. So again, it's the same concept, foundation plant, but now we're using an evergreen that's native. Mount Cuba has used, of course, the Phlox subulata on the right, and then down at the bottom was a little Shakespeare garden that was put in where the Yaupon holly, dwarf Yaupon, was being used as a parterre with the idea that the English classes would be coming in and planting the plants of Shakespeare in that parterre. The second strategy would be diversification. So instead of having a lawn, you're going to have a more interesting and diverse ground layer. So there's not a lot of change in terms of height in this garden of the ground layer. It's maybe 4 or 5 inches taller. It's a big sweep, but there's a lot of stuff happening, whereas before it was fairly poor condition turf. You could extend your bloom time by adding in different cultivars. In this case, the purple domes on the left, English countryside's on the right, on the bottom left picture. And so you would just make selections based on their bloom times to extend a bloom period. You can choose those plants. You can look at a site and say, what would I expect to be here? If I wasn't here and there wasn't a house here, what would I expect to be here? Oh, the soils are really dry and it's in the Piedmont. I think I'm going to probably find some upland meadow species. In this one in the middle, you would find these, you might have a wet meadow, you might have some stream edge species because of the flow of the water. And then in these bioretentions on the right, you would expect, if there was just a low-lying area next to a stream, you would expect wet meadow and woods edge species. And then you would go to that plant community and you'd be looking at which plants would fit your other design objectives. You might abstract or stylize a form you see in nature. So this big sweep of beach in the bottom right has about the same logarithmic sweep as both the switchgrass planting on the left and the river birch planting on the right, even though the curves are not organized in the same orientation, but basically using simple forms that you see in nature as your inspiration, but then you bring in your native plants into that palette. So this is just a very literal approach where we wanted to have an upland forest. We wanted to this is a demonstration garden at an elementary school. And so what's in the upland forest in that area. It was a partial list. And same for the xeric and same for the wetlands. And then those plants are put in as ways to be able to show the children at the school that if you're in the lowland, if you're in a wetland, you're going to see different things than if you're in an upland. Okay, so conservation landscapes at home, you might have a lawn, this flat lawn, and this was a homeowner that really wanted to showcase native plants, and so they took a woodland edge community, her designer did, and left the lawn panel, but really transformed the space very simply, and very high-end neighborhood, so it's very well accepted. And then finally, restoration. This is the most stringent, and this is where the plants rule more than the people rule. So this Mount Cuba Meadow restoration and Piedmont woodland restoration, they're really focused on having the plants in the patterns that they would naturally occur most likely. And the same was true when the Blue Mill Meadow was done, is that the plants that were selected were based on the Potomac River meadow community. So when do you do this evaluation of a design? Certainly at every step. When you're looking at a site to figure out what plants make the most sense, when you're looking at your design program to see what your client wants, when you're developing your plans, when you're thinking about the seasons, and then once you put it in and maintain it, it's very important to continue to do that assessment. So one of the things I want to do in the second half here is just go through a series of situations and talk about how to troubleshoot. I think it's always important when you're troubleshooting is to understand what it is you're looking at. What are the design goals before you start checking the boxes as to what's wrong with it. You know, is there an ecological? Is there aesthetic? You know, is it stormwater management? You know, what is it that you need to be evaluating the landscape for, and before you dig in? We also always emphasize planting for multiple values, you know, trying to get more bang for the buck, and being explicit, though, why this plant, because then when someone says, I don't like that plant, you can say, but this is what it's doing. So if you don't like that plant, let's find another plant that'll do those things. And when you do that, you find out that you don't need to put in as much synthetics. You have reduced, you're using your local materials. You're not adding irrigation water as much. You're recycling and composting on site, and you get better environmental outputs. Okay, so now let's look at, it's been installed, and now you're going to look at it and see how could it be improved. So you have a planter box on the left, and you have a conservation landscape on the right. And the conservation landscape on the right was fairly successful. You can see, though, that there were some blank spots where we had a shrub die out and some other pressure. So that's really just a replanting. You know, trying to figure out why that plant didn't survive is always good, but really the design itself held up, and that wasn't the problem. The problem was it was missing plants in this urban environment. And the similar is true on the planter box, is that all of this juncus, which was used in a very monoculture way, was really getting slammed when it came in, when the water comes in where that stone panel is, and there was a lot of replacement that had to happen. So at a certain point you say, well, should I replace it, or should we come up with another solution? So here's an example of the garden on the left. Plants are great, but it's right at the front door of the school, so socially it's not working. The plants and the butterflies are just going gangbusters, but really this is not something that the principal is proud of and wants to be the image of her school. And you can educate all you want, but at a certain point you have to think about, well, maybe we need the dwarf cultivars, or maybe we need some more clear order here. We need to step it from very short to taller, rather than having kind of the green wall effect that's going on right here. In the middle, these are great pollinator plants, the trumpet creeper and the passion flower, but they're not in the right place. This is a small planter, and it's growing up over the building, and the maintenance people are finding that it's a problem on that light. And so they really need to be put somewhere else on the site. Then on the one on the right, you can see the very anemic looking oak leaf hydrangea because it's not draining through as fast as predicted. So you can do all the work you want to get the right plant in the right place, but if the conditions don't match your expectations, you might have to change out the plants. Sometimes you might get asked, well, what do you think of this design? And it is a great pollinator solution, but it just kind of sticks out. It is taking water from the downspout. It's a nice conservation landscape in terms of providing a wide range of ecological benefits. But if you were to group up that Joe Pye and put it all in the central portion rather than in two clumps in that smaller garden, it would read better to the average person. Even though it's providing screening and all these other things, it needs better visual structure to be more adaptable to really people's expectations. We want to keep gardens stable, but as you see on the one on the left, because so much water comes ripping in there, and that stone is doing the job, but you've got to ask yourself, is this really the best thing? Is this, is this what our gardens are going to turn into, big stone panels? So how could that be different? You might be looking at creating alternating bands of stone and plants that are adapted to high impact environments. Like river oats might work in this situation, or you might be even just looking at putting in larger size stone so that you have bigger stone gradation, so the scale of the stone is not all the same. And on the right, this is pretty good shape actually. It's pretty stable. And that's about the right amount of stone. It's not overwhelming the scene. Here's another example. This is the same garden, and another example where I think if you were to add different scales of stone as opposed to this uniform stone panel, it would make this whole landscape read better. And if you hold your hand so that you can only see the plants and you don't see the stone on the left, and think about how different that looks. And so you could look at it and say, well, the plants are all great. There's nothing to fix here. And yet people might be looking at it going, man, it looks really rocky. I don't know about that. So it just depends. Is it the engineer looking at it, or the ecologist, or some sort of designer? When you use a trench drain or a dry stream bed, you're using a combination of the plant community and structural devices to get the water to go where you want it to go. And I understand not all conservation landscapes are about stormwater, but in our area, that's been the biggest area of growth for how people are using conservation landscapes. It's been to manage on-site drainage. So most of my examples will come from that. But when you add them in, you're adding in a beautiful line, which on the right, or you're adding in an interesting sequence of smooth to coarse to really coarse, that stepping down on the lower left, or you're adding a sense of peekaboo, where you've got that stone dry stream bed channel running through, which makes it interesting. And there's a little bridge which invites people to walk over. When you look at these are all the same thing, right? But honestly, not everybody's doing them as well as others. So the ones on the outside, I would say, didn't get the proportion of stone sizing quite visually right. Their plant choices are good, and they manage the stormwater they're supposed to manage. But if you want to make that better, you want to ask yourself, how could I make it more compelling visually? And so maybe on the one on the left, you're going to be looking at putting in some sort of rock outcrop planting that could handle occasional flooding to interplant in those gravel areas. You might be looking at adding in some sort of vertical feature on the one on the right. So it might be a piece of art, or it might be a plant that would just visually break it up so that it's not taking over the garden. Okay, so I don't know if there are any questions yet. I think we're about been going about a half hour, but I will continue until I hear otherwise.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Just remember that you can type in your questions at any time in the question box, and then I will convey them to Ann to answer. So go ahead, Ann.
Okay, so once you've got your garden in the ground, then you want to always step back and look at it. And so you can say, well, what's good about this garden and what could be better? So the garden blends in with the plantings, gets all the roof water, treats 1.5 inches of rain, which from our standpoint is great. You got pollinator support, it's adding color, and it diversifies an otherwise very simplified plant palette. But the plant selections, although they might have been logical, also were favorite plants of deer and bunnies on the ground cover level, so some other ground cover needs to be selected. And even though the homeowner had said they wanted white flowers to brighten up a dark spot, once the white flowers were in, he said, well, I really want more color than that. And that there was some erosion because it was coming in too fast, and that the black pipes that are corrugated could breed mosquitoes, so that really should be replaced with something smooth. So there are a couple of things you can do that make this garden better without actually changing much of the design at all. But the troubleshooting that comes with a garden isn't always about replacing the plants. You could look at this garden and you could say, it looks kind of messy, but it's in a kind of wild, messy context, so it's all good. We're all right with that. And the plants aren't being eaten by our friend the deer, and the water's not standing. So, is this the very most visually beautiful landscape? Maybe I would say not, but it's not horrible, and it does add a lot of diversity. And the designer that did this did properly take into account the types of things that would negatively impact the plant health, mostly the deer. This was a neighborhood, this is at the bottom of a very steep neighborhood, and this was right after a 3-inch rainstorm. I was very impressed. The only plants that had any kind of apparent damage were to the left of the one storm drain inlet on the left picture. And it's very simplified plant palette. A lot of irises were used, but plants that could handle the flow of the water, that it's right up against a natural area. So you didn't need to add a lot of diversity there, but you did need stability, and it adds a lot of color during the bloom season. And using enough rock, but in a way that was less visually overwhelming, was done very nicely in this garden. Contrast this is also at the bottom of the same neighborhood in a slightly different area. And you had 3 gardens in a row, and you can see the bottom left, and you see all that silt that's in there. Well, this happens every single time it rains. And so if you're called in to do something with this, it's got pachyra in there that's just totally smothered. It's got green-headed coneflower, and penstemon and other plants that should do okay there, but it's just too much. And so there's only so much a plant can do, there's only so much a community can do, and sometimes you have to just lighten the pressure on it. So this will probably be redesigned with some sort of drop inlet that will allow the energy of the water to dissipate and drop out the silts before it's allowed to go into the garden. And until then, it's really not worth replanting. When you are designing conservation landscapes for stormwater purposes and you're in the road right-of-way, you really have to be cognizant of what the maintenance schedule is. We get a lot of silt into our facilities, and it takes the concrete pad on the right was designed so that it could be easily shoveled off and then cleaned, and then the plants are okay. And we had one garden where we had to add an additional 3 yards of stone because of all the silt. In this case, I would say this is more of a maintenance problem. So the design is not great because of the steep side slopes and not enough plant material selected, but then they didn't make it better by cutting everything back in early winter. They should have left it up. The plants just don't have, there aren't enough of them. And so this is really as much a plant problem as a design problem. And if you're asked to create the planting for something like this, where people are walking across a parking lot, very, very challenging to get the balance right. And there are some other things you should be aware. So one of the things that people like to talk about are these wetland communities or wet meadow communities. And but most of those communities don't get the oils, they don't get the silt, they don't get the flow and everything that comes into it. And if it's a sandy soil in a basically clay soil environment, which is what these bioretentions are, high sand mixes, you're not really dealing with your native local area. You're really having to look at coastal plain plant communities for better selection. And the garden on the bottom right is what happens when you have salt water, briny water go into a facility on redwood dogwoods. And so all the ones in the front are dead, and the ones on the back where it's a little more sloped and they didn't have to sit in it, they were okay. So with your vegetation, you want to evaluate the plants. You want to look at the layout and say, is there something wrong, or is it actually just waiting to get established? Like these irises are doing fine, really fine, but the mulch is all gone. So maybe this isn't a good place for mulch. Maybe this should have been a place with a ground cover underneath those irises so that you don't get silt being washed away. This was a combination of conservation landscape and rain garden that we put in as a demonstration garden, and it perked great, and it was at the bottom of a hill and had a lot of water running to it, and you can see the quality of that water. So there were some things that we didn't take into account properly, and one was the amount of silt that was coming in. And then the other thing that happened was when we did this garden, it bogged up, so we had to break the berm and reduce it. And we should have set it offline so that it could fill up from the main flow path, and then once it was full, it wouldn't have been scoured out. But if you're willing to hang in with it, it does eventually stabilize. So stabilizing these gardens is sometimes a bit of a challenge. And this was really a wet meadow idea, and it's done really well. But the first year was really stressful because the homeowner next door to it was not happy. So you might get into a garden where you find caked mulch and missing plants. You want to ask, why are the plants missing? Were they grazed out, or is it because they were smothered out? And then that gives you the course of action of what you should do. This was another bioretention that was placed in the middle of a playground between two high energy play areas. And all of the plants in the middle were missing because the kids had been running through it. So you've got to ask yourself, is this really the right place to have plants? Unless you're going to put up a third fence, how are you going to keep the kids out? So that had to be modified. A lot of bioretention facilities like this are planted with a native plant palette, but then people say, oh, it's native, I don't have to do any care. And this is not true. Aside from the fact that you get groundhogs in that nice sandy mix, if you have invasive species around this garden, which almost all of them do, it's a perfect disturbed site for those invasives to get a good start. So you really have to pay attention to that and make sure that you are managing the edges as well as the garden itself. There's a lot of development out there that still uses a lot of grass. And this is a drainage swale. And the garden up on top, I don't know quite why it was done that way, but you can see the guys on the mowers do not get off the mowers. So you should estimate that and then have a different plant solution rather than turf on top of that slope. Grass clippings, it's common sense with any landscape, but not always done, to blow your clippings away from your planting bed. Particularly it adds nutrients and can cause clogging, not to mention covering up things that have to be inspected like grates and pipes. We also want people to use less chemicals. They're not supposed to use chemicals on bioretention, but of course you can see that people have. And if you're going to use it, you should use a water-safe practice. But you might also find that even with properly edged mechanical edging, that there are problems. And in this case, the slope was too steep for the plants selected. There was a lot of browse, and so they really need to come in with a different plant on the back slope there to replace those plants. And maybe just continue it on up so there isn't mowing in some of the places that they're mowing. This was out, the one on the right is a local high school. I was telling Sylvan about it. There are 52 bioretentions at this high school. And you got to wonder, why is it so steep? Why is it so far down? If you look at how, if you look at the box on the back right of that right-hand picture, that's the top of it is where the water would overflow. So it's really unclear why it needed to be this deep. And then the trash collects in there, and it's a problem. And with the steep sides, you're guaranteeing that you're going to get clippings in the wrong place. So the 3-to-1 rule or the 2-to-1 side slope rule is really a rule that needs to be reevaluated. You can get called into a garden and you're saying, oh, yeah, it's all native plants, but you know, some things need to be taken out because of neglect or bad pruning. You might see recycled trash. This bird has done a really good job of taking advantage of all the ecosystem services around their witch hazel. This was more neglect. It's not that the plant choices in the original plan were bad. It's just that they walked away from it, and the problem is that you can't do that.
And this might be
here's
a quick.
Okay.
There are two questions for you.
Okay.
And one of them has to do with the invasive plant issue in a way, and that's
okay.
Do you have a recommendation for establishing cover immediately after construction instead of mulch, like a ground cover or a biennial species that establishes quickly?
Well, it depends on where you're at as to what would be the right choice. But you know, if you're looking at a biennial, you don't have to use a native necessarily. It's hard to get those seeds. But using an annual to give you plant cover while the other things get going is a strategy that I've used. It's been very effective. You're going to want something that grows really fast. It could be as simple as, you know, I saw one lady use a pumpkin to cover her landscape until she got the other things big enough. So you have a wide range of choices. And if you're looking to do seed, you might find that you'd be looking at some of the wildflower seeds that are listed as annuals or biennials for your area.
Okay, thanks. And then this person, Lori Lilly, also asks, she's from Howard County, whether you have a suggestion of plant species that work well on rain garden berms. And rather than, you know, list them all out here, I wonder whether you just have a good resource from your site, perhaps.
Yeah, we have I think it's called Plants That Work. It's a handout that's on the RainScapes site, resources, and what we did is we created a short list for every type of location within a rain garden. So the side slopes, the inlets, the bottom area, the berm. So we broke it down that way and then talked about the difference between salty environments and non-salty environments, and it's on our website.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so here we got two plantings in the same site. One was given a bad haircut and one was not. And, you know, I think that both of them could be improved visually, but the bad haircut approach just really opens up the whole planting for weeds to jump in the winter because you're exposing, you don't have the grass cover to shade out winter weeds. So you not only do you have something that looks bad on the left, but you're actually creating an opportunity for weeds to jump in. So you want to time your maintenance. So particularly with warm season grasses, so you're cutting them back right before they start to grow in the spring, not cutting them back in the fall. To plant is to be an optimist, and you have to be patient, particularly with rain gardens. You know, the one on the left is what it looked like when it was first planted, and after one season it was full swing. This is the red, white, and blue concept, and the homeowners are piping their entire house to this garden. They're very ecstatic with it, and it sits in their landscape and makes sense. You want to look at, is the garden big enough? And if it's not big enough, have you set it aside so it doesn't get overwhelmed? Is it appropriately designed for your particular situation? Is it attractive? And yes, that is subjective, but is it balanced? Is it unified? How can you evaluate it using those design terms to make it stronger? And does it fit the budget? And will it actually persist if you don't have a lot of synthetic inputs? You want to design properly for your situation and anticipate the rapid change. In our Piedmont area, we have rapid change from one season to the next. And once you get the functions right, then you can focus more on your evaluation of aesthetics. This rain garden is doing just great. I mean, this is during a rainstorm, and then a day later and 2 days afterwards, it's very stable. This is right after planting. And those plants will fill in and create a very nice front garden for this man. So many examples of great design solutions, and people are getting better and better at this. So this is using goldenrods and irises and handling the physical problems that we create in our environments by having dense development, using the right plant palette, in this case facets of wetlands and for part sun, and this has that naturalistic garden aesthetic. Just a few more examples of could you evaluate this from a color, form, texture? Yes, of course you could. It's got a nice line, it's got a clear edge, it's legible, it's comprehensive, it's the right plants for the right exposure. It's a blended plant palette because you see all the hostas in the foreground, the Japanese maple. But as you move back from those, you have heucheras and other native plants that are appropriate for the situation and the maintenance regime. This was all lawn, and it's catching drainage. So here's an opportunity where the plants, and this is filled in more since this was taken, but where the plants are serving to soak up an awful lot of water that before was just running into the road. And even though these plants are really good at it, and even though there's a rain garden in there about where that bird bath is, and even though the driveway is permeable, when there was redevelopment behind this woman, she still had to do something more. So there's always something that you have to be evaluating. But this garden holds up from an aesthetic. This garden is a very deep rain garden. It's taking drainage from 8 houses. And it's visually linked to the rest of the landscape. So you have this garden that then flows into the rest of the garden yard, and aesthetically, it doesn't change the character. The character is the same. So you have Ilex verticillata and the Itea, and you have the Iris virginiana and the magnolias, and then that's repeated even in the conservation landscape that is behind it. And so the whole thing is a conservation landscape, whether it's dealing with stormwater or not. More bang for the buck. This is the Penn State Morningstar House, and you know, I love this slide, and I invite you to look at it later because it's doing so many things in such a tight space. It's organizing people, it's providing habitat for birds, it's visually interesting and sculptural. They've unified it. So I listed all these things on this slide because I think it draws the point home really well that you don't have to settle for just one or the other, and that we have the opportunity with ecological design to really create some great things. They look like gardens, they work as stormwater treatment plants, or they look like gardens, but they're actually allays of trees, and they're creating tree, bird habitat. That these challenges, like this flooding that was down 20 feet below this gutter, was turned into an aqueduct, and that aqueduct then becomes a sculptural feature in the landscape using this native plant palette. as part of the support of that visual. So when you're looking at a design, you want to build your skills in terms of evaluation of that design, in terms of the users. What is the goal? What is the design program, and is it sustainable? And that you want to apply those same standards to visual standards to a conservation landscape plus the ecological. So in some ways it's harder. But you can do fun things like this sculpture on the left. That tree in the foreground is actually a big sculpture. And the picture on the right, the rhododendrons, which admittedly both of these are in the Netherlands, but they're American native plants. You can create the sublime. You can really create wonderful effects, and that you can improve your site ecological function while making the world more beautiful. So if you have any questions, I am available to answer them.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was a wonderful presentation, and we do have a couple more questions. Willow Chile has two questions. One is, do you perform analysis of quantity and species of pollinators visiting each season? And related to that is, do you analyze quality of habitat for soil organisms?
So the soil organism piece is an area that I'm getting increasingly interested in, because I think it's kind of like the untold story. And the pollinator research is being done at Penn State and Mount Cuba in terms of evaluating which cultivars are preferred by pollinators, and so there are some surprises in the data. And I think that as we get better at designing, then you can do those types of counts of and the testing for the soil, and really learning, am I putting in a plant community for a disturbed soil site, and then over time it'll have to evolve to plants that like an undisturbed site. And so planning that sequence of garden is very important, but I don't think most people are there yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of sort of pending research, and it's also, so most of the studies that are being done now are on the attraction of individual species or cultivars to pollinators, but there's not a lot going on yet on how different design styles affect attraction to pollinators or birds or other organisms.
Right.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience? So you can type them in your question box, and I will relay them. And there was one very early on in your presentation. You just quickly mentioned the matrix approach to planting that Claudia West is now promoting, and Thomas Rayner. And I wondered if you could just briefly explain the term matrix approach for planting.
Okay, sure. They basically were able to bring in some of the research from Germany and talk about plants in terms of their sociability. So there was a scientist designer in Germany that had done very thorough analysis of how plants like to grow. So some plants like to grow and they spread by rhizomes and they create big masses of plants. Some plants like to grow as solitary beings, and some like to grow in small groups, and he called that plant sociability. And what they've been talking about is creating a vertical matrix of plants that goes ground cover, and then you have, which would typically be that large group type of plant. There was a great example up at the Salburn Arboretum, actually, where they'd use Pachyra underneath Baptisia. So they're layering plants in the same space because the root depths aren't the same, and are able to get a fuller coverage of a site and preclude a lot of invasion from weeds using this. And understanding that some plants will have, like Baptisia will do better if you put it in smaller groups rather than larger groups. You won't have the mildew issues because of it's the nature of the plant. If you were to find it in the wild, it would typically be growing by itself or with a few friends, rather than as a large sweep.
Great, thanks. That's a good explanation. Okay, so we have a question from Ellen Schoenfield-Beeks. Do you have some favorite ways of talking to folks about the reasons to plant in these ways? she needs to help folks understand, why you are using.
Yeah, so when I had my own design business, I rarely used the word ecology. I talked about, and I would select plants that I knew were tough and that were, because I had a lot of people that wanted very low maintenance solutions. So I met them where they were at. I talked about beautiful things, I talked about seasonal interest, I talked about plants that get along without much maintenance. And I assured them that their design would have all those things. And oh, by the way, as we got further along down the road, I might or I might not tell them that they were native. And it just wasn't, it was like I could have that conversation with them a year later after they had stuff in. But to the startup, I think you really have to meet people where they're at, and to get them to understand that they have to trust your judgment in terms of the plant selection and the organization to meet what they've said, what's their style. That's why I like that Konnichiwa Yell so much, because there's a tea garden that is absolutely a Japanese tea garden, but it absolutely is full of Southeastern natives.
And a great name, too. So, Anne, I want to thank you again for a really great presentation with a lot of excellent examples. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and Anne, thanks very much for your presentation.